In 1539, England needed an alliance. Henry VIII was running out of friends and wives. After splitting with Rome, he had few options left for allies or brides. The Reformation had thrown Europe into chaos. France and the Holy Roman Empire were circling like wolves. Henry wanted protection. He needed a Protestant partner. That's where Anne of Cleves came in. She wasn't chosen for her beauty or charm. She was chosen because her brother, Duke William of Cleves, was a powerful Protestant leader in Germany. Marrying her would send a message to Rome. Henry had allies, and he wasn't backing down. The marriage was arranged sight unseen. Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, to capture Anne's likeness. Holbein painted her in flattering light, too flattering, some said. But it was all Henry had to go on. Based on that painting, Henry agreed to the marriage. Anne was 24. She couldn't speak English. She'd never been to court. She had no idea what kind of man she was marrying. But that didn't matter. Nobody asked her if she wanted it. She was cargo in a royal deal, a Protestant noblewoman sent to England like a diplomatic package. She arrived on New Year's Day, 1540. Henry couldn't wait to meet her, but when he saw her in person, everything fell apart. She didn't speak his language. She didn't act the way English ladies did. Henry said she smelled bad. He called her the Flanders mare, and most importantly, he wasn't attracted to her at all. That was the beginning of the end, and the wedding hadn't even happened yet. But by that point it was too late to back out. The alliance with Cleves was political gold. Cancelling the marriage would look weak, and Henry never liked to look weak. So they married on January 6, 1540. Anne became Queen of England against the king's will. That night, Henry didn't consummate the marriage. He admitted as much to his closest advisers. He said she repulsed him. She was too plain, too foreign, too dull. But to the public, she was queen now, and Henry had to play along for a while. The truth is, Anne never stood a chance. She was a foreigner in a hostile court. Henry was embarrassed. He needed an excuse to get rid of her, and he'd find one soon. Anne was queen for just over 6 months. But from the moment she set foot in England, her fate was sealed. Anne was not tortured in the way we think of whips or racks, but what she endured was its own kind of cruelty. She was forced into a loveless marriage, mocked by the man who was supposed to protect her, and held hostage by politics. She was used and discarded like a pawn, and it only got worse from there. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. We want to know how far these forgotten stories reach. Anne of Cleves was crowned Queen of England on paper, but not in Henry's heart or his bed. From the first moment he saw her at Rochester Castle, Henry made his disgust known. He arrived in disguise, hoping to surprise her with some foolish fantasy of courtly romance. Anne didn't react as expected because she didn't recognize him. She didn't know English customs. She didn't play along. Henry stormed out of the room furious. He later told his court, "I liked her not." That phrase, repeated again and again, became the hammer that crushed her brief reign. The wedding on January 6, 1540 went ahead, but Henry gritted his teeth through the entire thing. He made no effort to hide his disdain. He barely touched Anne. At the altar he did not smile. That night he famously said he found her body loose and flabby, and that she had bad breath and sagging breasts. He repeated to his physicians that he could not bring himself to do his duty. Anne, for her part, likely had no idea what was happening. She spoke almost no English. She had been raised in a strict German court where women were expected to be quiet, obedient, and modest. She followed the rules. She didn't flirt. She didn't entertain the king. She didn't know she was supposed to, and she had no clue she was already being measured for removal. Court gossip spread like wildfire. Henry's advisers began whispering that the marriage was cursed, or that it had never truly been sealed. Even Thomas Cromwell, Henry's closest minister, who had arranged the marriage, started to sweat. He could see Henry turning cold, very cold. And when Henry turned cold, people lost their heads. Henry blamed Anne for his own failure to perform. He said she repulsed him too much for him to even try. But the truth was simpler. Henry was 49 years old, obese, riddled with infections. His leg ulcers oozed pus. His sexual health was failing. He blamed her body to hide his own. Still, none of that mattered. Henry wanted out. The political alliance with Cleves had already started to crack. Protestant powers weren't as useful as Henry hoped, so he needed a way to dump Anne without causing a diplomatic disaster. So the machinery began. Lawyers were summoned, priests were consulted, the marriage was examined from every angle. Could it be undone? Could it be erased? Meanwhile, Anne remained queen. She went through the motions, smiling in public, posing for portraits, trying to learn the language, but no matter how hard she tried, she was already done. This was not a honeymoon. This was a humiliation campaign. Henry made jokes about her to courtiers. He spoke openly of his desire for a new wife, one who pleased him, one who looked like Catherine Howard, the teenage beauty who had already caught his eye. Anne was publicly shamed, privately ignored, and royally humiliated, all without a single blow being struck. But the damage was deep. This wasn't just a rejection. It was the slow-motion erasure of her position, her dignity, and her future. And the worst part, she still didn't see it coming. Anne of Cleves was queen in name, but not in practice. For 6 months she sat in a palace that wasn't hers, beside a king who refused to touch her, surrounded by a court that treated her like a mistake. No wedding celebrations, no royal tours, no genuine affection, just a string of cold formalities and awkward silence. Henry VIII moved on emotionally the moment the vows were spoken. He spent his days flirting with Catherine Howard, just 16 at the time, and his nights avoiding his own wife. His council watched him closely, wondering what he'd do next. Everyone knew the marriage was a disaster, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. Anne, isolated and bewildered, tried to adjust. She studied English customs. She tried to make conversation. She dressed according to Tudor fashion, even though it was foreign to her. But nothing she did could bridge the distance. Henry had already made up his mind. She wasn't desirable. She wasn't worth the effort. What followed was 6 months of strategic neglect. Anne wasn't abused physically, but she was psychologically exiled. Henry made it known that he detested the match. The royal court, ever obedient to the king's moods, followed suit. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to report back on her words and actions. Her rooms were slowly emptied of influence, and worst of all, she was watched. Anne's every move was monitored by spies loyal to the crown. Every letter she received, every word she spoke, every reaction she gave, passed along to advisors like Thomas Wriothesley and Stephen Gardiner. They weren't just curious, they were looking for a way out, a legal excuse to annul the marriage. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged it all, was sweating bullets. He had staked his political survival on the Cleves alliance. Henry's growing hatred of Anne became Cromwell's death sentence. The king began to question everything Cromwell touched, and in Henry's court, doubt was a death warrant. Cromwell tried to salvage the situation. He pushed Anne to behave like a perfect queen. He hoped Henry's anger would cool. It didn't. Instead, it escalated. By June, the pressure to end the marriage was boiling over. Henry's eyes were locked on Catherine Howard. Anne was no longer just undesirable. She was in the way. But here's the brutal truth. Anne still thought she could fix it. She kept writing letters to her family, saying she was hopeful. She smiled in public, unaware that secret meetings were being held to destroy her status. She believed that by being obedient and patient, she could win the king back. She couldn't. Behind her back, the king's legal team was gathering evidence to prove the marriage had never been consummated. Henry insisted to his physicians that he had no desire for Anne. He claimed she was so distasteful he physically couldn't perform. His council took his word as gospel. Cromwell, desperate to survive, even tried to arrange a confession from Anne that she had previously been betrothed, another possible loophole to end the marriage. It didn't work, but none of it mattered. Henry had made up his mind. Anne would be cast aside. She wasn't beaten, she wasn't tortured, but she was slowly erased, step by step, until she had no power left at all, and worst of all, she was the last to know. This is what royal rejection looked like in Tudor England. No slaps, no chains, just silence, surveillance, and the slow turning of knives behind velvet curtains. On July 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves received a summons. The message was polite, but the meaning was clear. Her marriage was under review. She wasn't told everything, only that the King's Council required her cooperation. In truth, the verdict had already been decided. The marriage would be annulled. Henry wanted her gone. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a trap. Anne had two choices: resist and risk the block, or surrender and live. She chose to live. A panel of bishops declared that the marriage had never been valid. Their reason? It had never been consummated. Henry swore he hadn't touched her. Anne didn't argue. She agreed. She signed the documents. She gave up her crown. And in return, Henry gave her something no other discarded wife ever got: her head. Anne was granted a generous settlement, lands, manors, and an annual income. She was allowed to stay in England. She was given the title, the King's beloved sister, which sounded flattering, but it was mostly for show. It meant she'd never be queen again. It meant she'd never marry again. It meant she'd stay visible but voiceless. This was not a happy ending. It was a survival deal. Anne accepted it with grace because she understood what happened to women who didn't obey Henry. Catherine of Aragon had died alone, stripped of her title. Anne Boleyn had been executed. Jane Seymour had died giving Henry a son. Anne of Cleves had seen the pattern. She didn't want to be next. She didn't complain publicly. She didn't protest. In exchange, she kept her life, but she paid a cost: her dignity, her title, and any chance at a real marriage or family of her own. Henry moved on quickly. Just 3 weeks after Anne signed the annulment papers, he married Catherine Howard. She was barely 17. Henry was 50. Anne was forced to smile and play along as the new queen took her place. And Thomas Cromwell, the man who arranged the marriage with Anne? He wasn't spared. On the very same day the annulment was announced, July 9, he was executed by beheading. His final act had been signing away Anne's queenship. The king blamed him entirely. He needed someone to punish, and Cromwell paid the price. So while Anne lived, Cromwell died. Henry thought he was solving a problem. In reality, he was creating a different one. Catherine Howard's time would be short. Her fate would be bloody. But Anne was out of the story now, locked in a new kind of prison, one without chains, but just as isolating. She had money, land, and servants, but she had no power. She wasn't free. She was watched. She was expected to remain loyal, grateful, and silent. And for the rest of her life she did exactly that. This is the part of Tudor history they don't romanticize, the part where survival means silence, where beloved sister is a cage dressed in silk, where a woman escapes the axe but not the control. After the annulment, Anne of Cleves was no longer queen, but she wasn't a commoner either. Henry gave her homes, a household, and a comfortable income. To the outside world, she looked well taken care of. But behind the walls of Richmond Palace or Hever Castle, she was never truly free. Anne's new title, the King's beloved sister, sounded respectful. It wasn't. It was a muzzle. It meant she owed the king her loyalty, her obedience, and most of all her silence. She was not allowed to leave England. She was not allowed to remarry without Henry's permission. She couldn't write to her family freely, and she was closely watched. Every visitor, every letter, every whisper in her hall was monitored. Spies embedded in her household reported back to the Privy Council. They wanted to know if she ever expressed regret, if she ever spoke ill of the king, if she showed sympathy toward Catherine Howard, the girl who took her place. Henry didn't just fear betrayal, he feared embarrassment. Anne was living proof that he had made a mistake, and that mistake had to be kept quiet. The court still invited her to major events, coronations, Christmas celebrations, state visits, but she was always seated at the edge, never the center. She walked behind the real queens. She was not permitted to wear a crown. Her presence was tolerated, never welcomed. Anne adjusted. She hosted banquets, gave out alms, and presented herself with quiet dignity. But everything she did had to be approved. Even her personal staff had to be sanctioned by the king's advisors. She lived in royal houses, but she didn't own them. At any moment they could be taken away. And they were. When Catherine Howard was executed in 1542, Anne thought just for a moment that maybe she could be queen again. Henry was single. She was still young, still politically valuable, but Henry had no intention of returning to her. He married again, this time to Catherine Parr, and Anne was shoved further into the shadows. That fantasy died quickly. Anne realized her status was fixed. She would always be the tolerated guest, the former queen who never quite belonged. Over time, her finances were trimmed. Some of her lands were taken back, her household staff reduced. By the time Henry died in 1547, Anne had lost much of her protection. The next king, Edward VI, was a child. The Regency Council had no loyalty to her. She was just a leftover from a former regime. She petitioned for help, asked for the return of her lands. Most of those requests were ignored. Her status as beloved sister meant nothing now. She had outlived her usefulness. The English court moved on, and Anne was left in her castle, rich. Yes, but irrelevant. She had no voice in politics, no family nearby, no purpose beyond survival. The same woman who had once been married to the most powerful king in Europe was now treated like old furniture, kept around out of politeness, but never used again. This wasn't freedom, this was controlled exile. She wasn't beaten, she wasn't tortured, but her life was monitored, limited, and stripped of meaning. She was kept quiet, kept still, and kept under the king's thumb until the day he died. And even then, England found a new way to forget her. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. For Anne of Cleves, that death meant the end of the only thread keeping her tethered to influence, even if that influence had always been conditional. With the king gone, Anne's title meant nothing. She was not the widow of a king. She was not the queen dowager. She had no children to secure her place in the new reign. She was just a footnote, a former wife now floating in political limbo. The new king, Edward VI, was a boy of 9. Power lay with the Regency Council, and none of them owed Anne anything. In fact, most saw her as an inconvenient leftover from Henry's failed foreign policy. She didn't fit into the Protestant future they envisioned. She was German, older, childless, and had no English allies. Almost immediately, her income was slashed. Her requests for financial assistance were delayed, ignored, or denied outright. Lands once gifted to her under Henry's goodwill were taken back. What had once been called a generous settlement was now slowly being unraveled. She had no legal standing to fight it. Worse still, Anne had no advocates at court. She had lived quietly for years, never making political alliances, never raising her voice. That silence, once her means of survival, now left her completely isolated. The people no longer remembered her. The court had new favorites. The nobility had new games to play. Anne of Cleves became a relic, still alive but already erased from public consciousness. She moved between properties, mostly staying at Chelsea Old Manor, a cold, damp estate outside London. Her servants grew fewer. Her household shrank. By the early 1550s, her status was lower than that of any noble widow of her rank. She was living in the margins of power, tolerated only because she didn't cause trouble. When Edward VI died in 1553, a flicker of hope returned. Mary I, Henry's Catholic daughter, became queen. Anne had always been sympathetic to Mary. She even attended Mary's coronation, walking behind the new queen in a show of support. For a moment, it seemed like she might finally regain a piece of what had been lost. But it didn't last. Mary was fighting her own battles, religious rebellions, legitimacy crises, political pressure. She had no time for Anne. The aging former queen faded further from the court's attention. Once again, Anne was shoved to the side. By this point, Anne was only in her early 40s, but she looked much older. Years of stress, loneliness, and illness had taken a toll. Her health declined quickly. Reports from the time say she suffered from chronic digestive problems, possibly stomach cancer, but we can't be certain. What is certain is this: no royal physicians came, no royal funds were allocated to comfort her. She was allowed to suffer quietly. She had no children to care for her, no political allies to speak on her behalf, no husband to protect her. The woman once sent across Europe to marry a king now lay sick and forgotten, tucked away in a cold manor house, far from the throne she once held. Anne was not executed like Anne Boleyn. She was not exiled like Catherine of Aragon. But her slow death by neglect tells a story just as cruel. It's the story of a woman used as a bargaining chip and then left to rot when the deal lost value. And England let her disappear. In the summer of 1557, Anne of Cleves became seriously ill. By now she was living quietly at Chelsea Old Manor, far removed from the politics and power of London. Her household was modest, her influence gone. There were no royal visits, no processions, no concern from the crown. She was the only one of Henry VIII's wives still alive, and no one seemed to care. Historical records suggest Anne may have suffered from cancer of the stomach or uterus, though medical diagnosis in the 16th century was crude at best. What is known is that her illness dragged on for months. She experienced persistent pain, extreme weakness, and weight loss. Tudor medicine had no real answers. She was treated with the standard mixtures of herbs, bloodletting and poultices. Nothing worked. As her condition worsened, her petitions to the crown for financial help were ignored. The same court that once gave her castles now questioned the cost of firewood for her manor. Her servants were unpaid. Repairs to her house were delayed. It was quiet neglect, but it was still neglect. Anne was now 41. Still young by modern standards. But in Tudor England, she was a worn-out shadow of her former self. She had spent 17 years in England, nearly all of it alone. She had no children, no husband, no real friends in court, and the religious tides had turned again. Mary I was persecuting Protestants, the faith Anne had been raised in. Anne kept her head down. She didn't speak out, but she knew better than anyone what happened to women who crossed monarchs. She had survived Henry by staying silent. Now she faced death the same way. She drew up her final will in July 1557. It was simple. She left small sums to her remaining servants. She asked for a modest burial. She made no dramatic statements. She didn't accuse anyone. She just tied up what little remained of her life. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557. No family was by her side. Her brother, Duke William, never came. Her relatives were scattered across Europe. The court didn't mourn. No state funeral, no royal tributes. Just a brief note in the royal ledger: the Lady Anne of Cleves is deceased. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, not in the main royal vaults, but in a side chapel near the tombs of forgotten nobles. Her grave was small, plain, and quickly overshadowed by the greater monuments around it. Today, most visitors walk past without knowing she's even there. Anne's death was not violent, but it was still a tragedy. It was the final insult to a life spent being used, silenced and ignored. She had done everything asked of her. She had bowed when told, smiled when humiliated, and stepped aside when discarded. And in return, England let her die quietly, as if she had never mattered. But she did matter. She was the only one of Henry's wives to outlive him, the only one to escape with her life, the only one to avoid execution, exile, or childbirth death. She played the game, and she survived it. But survival came with a price, a slow, bitter ending, alone in pain and erased from memory. That was Anne of Cleves' final chapter. Not a queen, not a traitor, just a forgotten woman who once wore a crown, then died without comfort or legacy. Anne of Cleves was buried on August 3, 1557, just weeks after her death. Her body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, but it wasn't a burial fit for a queen. There were no crowds, no eulogies, no royal honors, no procession draped in black velvet, no solemn church bells, not even the elaborate tomb Henry had ordered for himself. Anne's final resting place was tucked away, far from the spotlight, far from the thrones she had once walked beside. Her grave lies in the south aisle of Westminster Abbey's high altar, but unless you know where to look, you'll miss it. It bears a modest brass plate with her name and a simple inscription. There is no effigy, no crown, no indication that this woman was once married to the most powerful king in Europe. In fact, there is little about the tomb that suggests royalty at all. No Tudor monarch attended her funeral. No royal family members stood at her side. No ambassadors were sent from her homeland in Cleves. Her household arranged the burial, quietly and efficiently, as if they were cleaning up the last page of a closed chapter. And that was the end of Anne of Cleves. In the official records of the Tudor court, her name appears briefly, then disappears. She is not included in many histories of Henry's reign. When school children memorize the fates of Henry's wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, Anne is often summed up with just that, survived, as if that were enough to explain what she endured. But Anne's story was never about just surviving. It was about enduring rejection, humiliation, isolation, and the quiet cruelty of being forgotten. She was forced to give up everything she had, her country, her language, her status, and was rewarded with silence. She didn't challenge the king. She didn't rebel, and for that she was spared. But that mercy came with its own punishment, a life lived in a gilded cage, and a death treated like a footnote. Anne of Cleves should have been remembered for her intelligence, her dignity under pressure, her political usefulness, and her ability to navigate a ruthless court without losing her life. But Tudor England did not value women like Anne. If you weren't a beauty or a mother to a male heir, you were dispensable. If you didn't produce drama, you didn't produce legacy. Today she remains the least known of Henry's wives, not because her life lacked pain, but because she hid it too well. Her story matters because it exposes a different kind of brutality, the kind that doesn't leave blood on the floor but leaves a person erased. Her torture wasn't physical. It was slow, administrative, and wrapped in silk, but it was still real, and it still destroyed her. Anne of Cleves is buried beneath centuries of dust, both literal and historical. But for anyone who wants to understand the cost of power, the cruelty of silence, and the quiet strength of women who survive by surrendering, her story is essential. She didn't die with a scream, she died with a whisper. And that whisper still deserves to be heard.